r/AskReddit. Serious police of Reddit. Who was the worst criminal you've ever had to detain? What did they do? How did you feel once they'd been arrested? Had a call once in a major metropolitan area during my probation period some years ago. The fire dept called us for help saying they had been threatened with by knife-wielding maniac while attempting to render aid to someone. My partner and I got there and saw the FD just standing around, so we're thinking, okay, this guy's probably gone and we will have to just take a report for them and get to our next call. That's the first time I heard the screams of someone about to die. The shrill terror in a person's voice is completely distinguishable from your everyday scream for help or yells of anger. It sends a shiver down your spine. My partner and I didn't have time for backup to arrive or make a tactical plan, so we entered an apartment complex by ourselves and followed the screams until we located a door we thought they were coming from. I kicked in the door and we entered to find that knife-wielding madman stabbing a woman in the chest. Shots are fired and the man goes down. As though a scene from a movie, after the shooting, backup comes running in to clear the rest of the apartment while I awkwardly handcuff this man who is bleeding all over my uniform, has missing either his radius or ulna. One of the two wrist bones from a bullet shattering it. There's blood everywhere and you can smell it in the air. This is also the first time I held a person while they were dying, which isn't particularly pleasant either. The man passed shortly after in the ambulance, even with the fire dept outside already. We later discovered the man was on drugs and suffering from mental illness. He had attempted to kill himself a week prior and failed, so the higher ups believe this is how he wanted to finish himself off. The woman survived. First post. Throwaway account. I'm terrible with dates and time frames if I didn't write it down, but I'll never forget October 26th, 2013. This was in Brooklyn. Squad called an 85 at such and such address. A neighbor had called in an assault in progress and the detective squad happened to be on the block for another reason. They got there fast and met the perp coming out the front door. We get there a couple minutes after as the perp is being walked in handcuffs to the car. I went into the house to see if everybody was okay and what the 85 was about. Long story short, perp hacked a woman and her 4 kids, infant to 12 years old, to death with a meat cleaver. Mom and oldest were still breathing when we came in the door, but not for long after that. 3 babies were all in the back bedroom. The apartment looked pretty much like what you would imagine if you tried to imagine something like that. You could taste the blood in the air. There was so much of it. When I walked out to get a look at the perp, a detective told me, see if you can get his name, but don't ask him anything else. Guy was seated in the back seat in handcuffs and had a look in his eyes that I can't even describe here. The devil was let loose in that apartment. Received a call from a concerned neighbor in an apartment complex. She advised a female upstairs was screaming for help. Me and my partner conducted a knock and talk and a very large male answered the door wearing boxers. We asked him if anyone else was in the apartment. He looked back towards the bedroom, turned and looked back at us and paused for a second and then said no. Me and my partner looked at each other sensing something was wrong. We looked down and observed blood on the tile floor and made entry due to exigent circumstances. I spoke with the male in the living room and I see he was getting extremely worried. My partner walked into the bedroom and I see his face lose its color. He stepped back and started shouting, lock his ass up now. He then tried to make a run for it. After he was detained, we returned to the room and I saw a girl locked in a dog cage, beaten half to death. The investigation revealed he had been holding her hostage in the apartment for several months, raping her and pimping her out to sick fucks and forcing her to eat dog food. She was unable to stand. I believe both legs and arms were broken. Both eye sockets were so badly broken and bruised they swelled up over her eyes. The bedsheet, which I could only assume was once white, was completely covered in bloodstains. I've been on the scene of somewhere around 100 plus murders, countless auto fatalities and everything in between, and to this day it's just about the only thing that gets to me. I couldn't understand how someone could be that evil. When I returned to my patrol vehicle to run their information, I looked at her driver's license photo and couldn't recognize her. That's how badly she had been beaten. I've seen her once since the incident. She is now blind in both eyes and can still hardly walk. It sucks to think about how many times I've been at that apartment building on other calls while she was locked in a cage and had probably been standing just feet away from her. The entire time the suspect was in my backseat, he was just staring me down through my rearview mirror with the smuggest fucking grin on his face. I had to step out of the car and get away from him because I was getting so worked up. I don't think there's a punishment severe enough that monster. Copy and paste of a previous post because I don't enjoy typing this story out. Cop here. I responded to a child not breathing. On arrival I find a 2-year-old girl wearing only unders, unconscious on the cement kitchen floor. She is freezing cold, pale, foaming at the mouth, and barely breathing. I spent the next 6 hours by her side as detectives learned that mom's boyfriend was pissed that she wouldn't stop crying, so he picked up by the waist, over his head, and slammed her on the ground. Twice. When mom got out of the shower he told her she wasn't breathing right. Mom uses the girl's asthma inhaler twice and waits. An hour and a half later she goes to her neighbor's house to use her phone to call her mom. The neighbor overhears the conversation about baby not breathing and takes it upon herself to call 911. The girl received a basal skull fracture which caused little seizures. She vomited several times but lay on her back for over an hour. She aspirated the vomit repeatedly. For nearly 2 hours that little girl lay on the ground with her skull bleeding into her brain, her body temp being sucked into the floor, trying to breathe vomit. And for the next 6 hours I sat with her and held her hand, stroked her hair, and watched her die, hoping that her little brain shut down and blocked out everything that was happening. That case still makes me tear up to this day, and it was one of the 3 worst calls I've ever been on. I don't know how someone can do that to a baby. Edit. I apologize for the lack of clarity. I wrote this last night through tear-filled eyes and then went to bed. Paramedics were called. They arrived seconds after I did. They did everything they could. I rode in the ambulance with her to the hospital. I stayed with her the entire time because in a possible death investigation we keep an officer with the person throughout until the medical examiner takes custody of the body. So I stayed with her in the went to court scan with her, etc. Her little brain had been deprived of oxygen too long. There was no surgery that could save her. BF fled during the initial chaos of officers and medics arriving. He was caught later that night, without incident. He was charged and convicted, but that doesn't undo what he did. How do you deal? That's a good one. You come home and hug your own kids. You have a beer with the other guys that were on scene. You realize that if it weren't for your job, assholes like that would get away with it. And then you get in your car and do it all again tomorrow. Thanks for listening. Be good to each other. Stories like this and others can be found at /r/Tales from Thesquidka. Edit. Hey guys, thanks a bunch for the overwhelming response and support. Quit with the gold. If you want to pay it forward, next time you're in line with a cop, buy his coffee or soda and say thanks for what you do. Those little moments really do help. I honestly feel that the majority of the people I arrest aren't bad people and aren't criminals, per se. That being said, there are a couple dozen arrests that stand out in my mind. One in particular sticks out, not necessarily the worst, just one that sticks out the most. The suspect was approximately 40ish, had a 15-year-old daughter, was a methamphetamine addict, lived in complete squalor. They get evicted, and daughter gets taken into state custody. After a year of counseling, finally discloses that her father would inject her with methamphetamine and rape her. Therapist comes to us, and we bring her in for an interview. This girl, I believe may have been 17 by now, is no girl. She's intelligent, articulate, and lived well beyond her years. She details in remarkable detail how one night her father injects methamphetamine into right forearm. This happens several times. One night he is extremely high, gets her high. As she is walking into the kitchen he pins her against the wall and rapes her. This begins to happen on a regular basis. Suspect eventually convinces daughter to start bringing friends home. Suspect injects friends with methamphetamine and rapes them as well. Daughter continues to bring different friends home so that dad will rape the friends rather than her. Eventually when they get evicted, father kicks daughter to the curb and two of daughter's friend go live out of dad's car in a nearby park. While these kinds of things happen all the time, it was the victim that struck me. When asked why she didn't tell someone, she replied, "The first time it happened, when he pinned me against the wall, all I could remember thinking over and over, this is my life now. This is my life now." I will remember those words for the rest of my life, as clear as they were said to me. I can still hear the inflection and tone in her voice. About 8 months later I ran into one of the other victims, the daughter's friend. After dad was evicted, he lived out of his car with her. She was 15ish at the time. Initially she was going to cooperate in prosecution, however, disappeared. She's 18 to 19 now. When I last saw her I didn't recognize her until I saw her identification. Heroin, methamphetamine and the streets have destroyed her. She won't be alive much longer. I've been in the police for nearly 2 years now. I was working a late shift on Christmas Eve, which is usually a matter of holding the fort and counting down the clock until the end of shift. We get a call, sudden death, an elderly gentleman. A shame certainly, but nothing more than assumed routine. Inspecting the body for signs of trauma and calling the undertakers to remove the deceased. We get there and go in. The gentleman is lying on his sofa with a duvet covering him. I performed the usual inspection of the house, looking for anything out of place or suspicious. Not that it'd be easy, the house was like your over-the-top hoarder's palace. After some inquiries it became apparent that the gentleman had lost the use of his legs many years before and lived downstairs, relying on his daughter to care for him utterly. We have to inspect the body for any signs of trauma or suspicious marks prior to calling the undertaker, so that we are sure that there is nothing untoward in relation to the death. We lifted off the duvet, as only his head was showing, and I was rather taken aback and stunned. The main images, having studied history at university, that came to mind was the pictures from the liberation of the concentration camps, emaciated and starved corpses. This man had been dead for no more than 4 to 5 hours, yet he was all skin and bones. He relied on his daughter to care for him, and he clearly had not been. He lay there, in his own filth, wasting away without anyone properly looking after him. It was utterly despicable. Death has a very distinct smell. It clings to your uniform and your body. I finished my shift in the early hours of the morning, went home and tried to sleep. I couldn't. I just lay there, eyes wide open, the man's body and his haunting stare taking centerpiece in my thoughts. In the end, I thought, fuck it, I'm not going to sleep at this rate. I got in my car and drove the 100 miles to my parents to spend Christmas Day with them. To end on a slightly more humorous note, whilst opening one of the doors in the house a cat jumped out of the darkness at me, and I absolutely shit myself, nearly tumbled down the stairs with a shrill yelp. Sorry for the long post. Late to the party, but whatever. We got a call for a home invasion. 3 guys kicked down the front door with Tech 9 machine pistols and put everyone on the ground. However, one of the sons, who lived at house, was able to escape out the back. He ran to the neighbors and called 911. Once the home invaders took their loot, they escaped to a yellow 90s mode Ford Mustang. The son saw all this and got into his car. He starts to follow the crew as they make their getaway while still on the phone with 911. Well, the bad guys see this and start shooting at the son, who promptly backs off and loses sight of the guy. While responding to the call, my sergeant spots their car. Don't be an idiot and drive a unique vehicle at midnight. A small car chase follows until the bad guys crash into an abandoned business. 3 guys bail from the car. Good for both of us, as they left their weapons inside the car. I'm there during all of this. We see one guy in a fenced commercial yard. He is stripping off his body armor and throwing down his cocaine. I jump the fence and confront him at gunpoint. He freezes and you can see the gears in his head start working. He decides to give up and we detain him. Probably helped that a K9 officer was right behind me. Other officers continue the search and find another guy inside a large trash can. The guy refuses to come out, so they kick over the can. Right as they kick over the can, they release a dog who bites him on the top of the head. We never found the third guy. Back to my guy now. Since there were still outstanding suspects, I kept him in the yard and was checking my surroundings until I could get bolt cutters to get out. He sneaks a phone call in by reaching into his front pocket and tells someone goodbye. I finally get him into a patrol car and read him Miranda. The guy invokes and stays silent. What was weird was how calm he was. He had a 1,000-yard stare and didn't appear to have a care in the world. He has a monotone voice that just seeped creepiness. The detectives finally arrived and give me the scoop on him. Apparently it's a cartel hitman. He was in the States doing work when his girlfriend threatened to snitch. He took her out to eat dessert, bound her up, then burned her alive. He was also a suspect in several other murders in town. We eventually go to trial. He gets convicted and is currently serving 67 years. The other guy we caught was going to go to trial. However, he saw the outcome and decided to take a plea for 25 years. Several years ago, I was called to a rural residence in my jurisdiction for a heated disturbance involving firearms. I work a rural county that covers almost 1,000 square miles with 3 other deputies. 4 deputies are on duty at any given time covering this area. To ease in keeping up with the story, the violator will be called grandfather in his upper 60s. The son of grandfather / 911 caller will be called son in his 30s. And the victim / granddaughter will be called child, 7 years old. When I arrived on scene, I saw the son standing with a handgun in his hand and the handgun stuck in the mouth of the grandfather, who was on his knees. This took place in the front yard of this residence. My camera / audio was rolling due to me running lights / siren to this call, so all this is recorded and played a significant role in the prosecution. I slid to a stop and exited my car expeditiously while taking cover behind the driver's side wheel well. I had my Glock 34 out quickly and began giving commands to the son. He was in tears and screaming. The grandfather was motionless on his knees with a gun in his mouth and hands up. The son was screaming at me that grandfather, had been sexually assaulting the son's daughter. I told him repeatedly that I was here to help and all that good stuff. He took the gun out of the grandfather's mouth and threw it behind him in the grass and stuck his hands up. I moved forward and placed him into handcuffs as well as the grandfather due to me now knowing anything else about this situation. I then recovered the firearm and placed it in my vehicle. I confirmed the only other person at the residence was the child, who was inside at the window and watched all this unfold. My help was on the way, but still about 20 minutes away. I brought the son in front of my car to be recorded and asked what was going on. He explained that his daughter and his father, grandfather to the child, all lived at the grandfather's house due to him losing a job recently. The son had a tough time after coming home from Iraq and holding a job. The son explained to me that he asked the grandfather for permission to use his laptop. He received permission and began looking stuff up on the computer. The son found a suspicious looking folder on the desktop and opened it. This folder had hundreds of pictures of the child, his daughter, in extremely explicit positions as well as performing sexual acts on the grandfather. Needless to say, he flew into a new dimension of pissed off and immediately retrieved his handgun and dragged his own grandfather to the child, out in the front yard to avoid bloodying up the house in his own words. He pistol whipped him and placed him on the ground and stuck his pistol in the grandfather's mouth. He never did explain to me why he called 911 instead of shooting the grandfather. I placed him back into my vehicle and told him to remain quiet because I needed to get information from the grandfather to get a conviction. I guess I should have mentioned I spent several years as a criminal investigator prior to going back to the patrol division, so I knew exactly what to look for and obtain during the investigation in order to obtain a conviction if a crime did in fact occur. I then brought the grandfather in front of my car and got out a written Miranda form from my car. I read and explained to the grandfather his rights, to which he signed in writing, acknowledging he understood them. The grandfather then waived his rights in writing and spoke to me without an attorney. I tried to play to his emotion and asked him what was happening. He hung his head and told me he did something bad. I tried to belittle it and say stuff like at least no one is dead, we can all work through this, etc. He proceeded to tell me that he had been molesting his granddaughter, the child, for several months and had pretty much done everything but have intercourse with her. I asked him if he photographed any of this activity and he acknowledged he did. I asked him where it was and he told me that he had it on the desktop. A few jump drives and some new photos should still be on the digital camera. Thinking about his Fourth Amendment rights, I got a consent to search form out and requested he sign it to allow me to collect these items. He signed it. Dumbus. I would have gotten it anyway with a search warrant due to an overwhelming amount of facts present so far. I collected these items and did my best to comfort this precious little girl. I had my backup transport the grandfather to the jail and I took the son and child to the office to interview him. Long story short, the grandfather first pleaded not guilty and a trial date was set. The morning of trial, he took a plea for 80 years to serve for what he did. As far as how that made me feel, I will never understand how that son didn't turn his own father's head into a canoe. I cannot fathom the rage and anger he must have felt. I kept in contact with the son after the arrest and through the prosecution phases. He eventually told me he didn't shoot him because he didn't want his daughter to lose her grandfather and father in one day. He thought he would go to jail for killing him. I have dealt with more savage people and been in a few rough spots before, but the cold-heartedness demonstrated by this bag of douche towards his own granddaughter blew my mind. This guy and his wife start fighting in their apartment in South Los Angeles. It escalated into the guy picking up the 5-month-old baby and charging at the wall with the baby's head as a battering ram. He then threw the infant out of the 3rd floor window. As I sat in the front of my police car with this guy, cuffed in the back seat, all I could think about was a Pulp Fiction type turnaround and put a hole in his head so it would ever happen again. It was very early in my career and made me think about whether I could handle 25 to 30 years of these kinds of things and what kind of person it would turn me into. The child actually survived and the man convicted. I'd put this incident away in a little sealed box in my head and forgotten about it until seeing this thread. Now I'm sweating and angry again. Edit for some additional info. As I've sat and thought about this, I know that the baby had a fractured skull and they were concerned about brain damage in the neck/spine. I know that the child survived, but I never followed up because I completely put this out of my head, and until the thread popped up, you could say that I'd completely forgotten about it. The best I can recall was that the guy got 18 years prison. Thanks for all the concern and support. I'm okay, but just for good measure I might have a chat with the depth psychologist about it. It's a big city. Bad things happen, and as the hydraulic press channel would say, we must deal with it. Some things get to you more than others, but for the most part we learn how to deal with it and not take it home with us at the end of the day. I've been on 23 years with a few more to go yet. With all I've seen and done, I have one rule that I live and work by: treat everyone as well as they will let you treat them. It has served me well. I didn't do the actual arresting, but I spent several months supervising Kristen Berry in custody after she and her husband, Joseph Walsh, were arrested for killing their infant son, Chance. Her husband beat Chance during a drug bender while she watched and complained they would get caught, saying "you're gonna fucking kill him," and recording audio of the incident on her phone in case they were caught. Her husband shoved a baby wipe down Chance's throat, where it got stuck, and he started to choke. To get it out, they pried his jaw open with pliers, breaking it and tearing out Chance's little tongue. When they finally retrieved the wipe from his throat, they left him to slowly die of his injuries in his crib. Kristen posted a Facebook message the day after Chance died saying how she was excited for their first family vaca. She never called 911. She said she didn't want to lose both people she loved in the same day. They left Chance to decompose for several days. When the smell overwhelmed them, they wrapped him in garbage bags and put him in a closet for several more days. Then, they buried him in a trash pile near a homeless camp and took off to start a new life together like Bonnie and Clyde. While in jail she was insufferable. She talked endlessly about how much money she was getting in support and bragged about how much commissary she could buy. She cried during NA meetings about how her son was murdered by her husband and then turned around after the civilian meeting leaders left and talked about how Joseph is the love of her life and she'll never stop loving him. She was quick to become angry over little things and routinely tried to either intimidate or impress other inmates with the severity of her crime. She asked me to print a picture of her son so she could have a picture to take to prison with her. She also asked me to look up publisher information so she could write a book about her experience. She is absolutely the worst person I have ever encountered, and I had the hardest time of my professional career dealing with her pure sociopathic tendencies. She was not an abused wife who was conditioned not to cross her violent husband. She gave her first child away at a Denny's. Her second died after developing an infection that no medical care was sought for, and she helped brutally kill her third child. She deserves the death penalty and it's a shame she won't get it. Police Redditor with 24 years on the job with 8 years of that being assigned to sex crimes. The most evil prick I ever dealt with was about 2 weeks before Hurricane Katrina. A 17-year-old girl disclosed to family members that her father had been sexually exploiting her since she was young and the last incident was the previous night. On the forensics side, I recovered her father's semen from her stomach and off of the bed sheets. It took me several hours to interview the suspect. He was part of the African identity / Moorish nation and he tended use circular logic. Think about trying to interview Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton. It was so frustrating that my partner walked out of the interview. Eventually, I began talking to the suspect about African identity, and because I have a large base of useless knowledge we wound up connecting. It was pretty funny imagining a white cop talking the suspect about the philosophy of moves John Africa or your Benyor. Eventually, he asserted that because his ancestors were brought to America against their will he was not subject to our laws or customs. Therefore, it was his duty to introduce his daughter to her obligations as a woman. When she was about 8 years old he had her performing oral sex on him. Then when she was 10 years old he decided that she was mature enough to decide if she was ready for sexual intercourse. From that point forward he began having sex with his BO daughter a few times a week for the next several years. The suspect even began referring to his daughter as his second wife. He also physically abused the younger male sibling of my primary victim and used threats to terrorize his wife. I still recall driving home after working a 18-hour shift on the case and watching the sun coming up while thinking to myself, that is the most evil prick I have ever come across. Then when I got home I could not sleep because I realized that there was probably someone more evil than him roaming this planet and our lives were set to intersect at some point. The good news is that he pled guilty and took 40 years without benefits, which means he will probably die in custody or be in his 80s when he gets released. Oh boy. Grabbed a guy walking down the street with a shotgun in one of those 12-can beer holders cigarette companies used to give away. Yeah, I'm old. We get the cuffs on him and he starts getting all chatty in car about all the other guns that he has. One thing leads to another and we use his statement to get a warrant to get the rest of the guns. We go to the apartment with the warrant and there are hundreds of different firearms and corresponding boxes of ammo and we start cataloging it and carrying it out. Then we notice cases of photo albums and videotapes. And it's child porn. I take random samples and as difficult as it is, and to the normal human being, it's difficult shit, confirm that it's children being photographed doing sexual things. It's logical that given the sampling, that the rest of it was kiddie porn too. Well, not enough for the adder who took the case. I explained to her how we arrived at the number, and she said that in order for him to be charged for all the porn, that I would have to testify that all of it was indeed porn. I was the arresting officer. I was swearing out the complaint, and I also had to make sure asshole went to jail for a very long time. I sat in a room in the station house for hours on end going through hundreds of photo albums full of children being destroyed. I viewed videotapes of innocence being swept away, and in the end, I wept. I did not stop weeping for days. 20 some odd years later, I still have my moments, and every so often I'll see a kid that looks familiar and I'll think. It haunts me constantly, because I couldn't save them. I'm supposed to defend the ones that can't defend themselves. That was my sacred vow, and yet, all I could do was catalog their horror. Years later, I was a first responder to the WTC attacks, and saw horrors that no person should ever have to see, and yet, 9/11 wasn't close to being my worst day on that job. Thanks again, Reddit, for letting me rant. Thank you so much for watching the whole video. Please leave a like and subscribe.